Why did you shoot my daddy and me?
A nation on edge, concerns about crime rising.
My stepson was murdered back in 2016.
From brazen shoplifting to horrific homicides. How bad are things really, and what's actually to blame?
But guess what? We're fed up. We are fed up.
Now on Scripps News, it's the reality, the fear.
Oh my God, he's got a gun.
The facts.
You got to be mindful and conscious of your surroundings.
The future.
Get more criminals off the streets.
Now, a Scripps News special, The Truth About Crime. Live from Baltimore, Del Walters.
And good evening from Baltimore, which just this month tracked homicide number 100. Scripps News Baltimore, Channel 2 here is tracking that. 10 of those victims under the age of 18. The oldest, 75. 8 and 10 of those victims are black. The reality of life here in this city, which I have worked in for years and actually love, if you listen closely, you can hear the sounds of a city trying to come back from a pandemic. A bus that just went by moments ago that was half empty because the factories here closed many moons ago. People coming and going to the O's who are playing just up the street. I'm Del Walters, live in Baltimore tonight. In the hour ahead, we're going to take an honest look at crime across the city and how that crime matches what we see and hear on streets and cities across America. From the murders to the shoplifting to the store closures that are leading to cities really having to shutter their downtowns. What is happening and how bad are things really? In moments, I'll be joined by the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama, which is seeing a rise in gang-related violence there, and another state where lawmakers are pushing for the system to get tough on crimes, especially crimes involving fentanyl. Also waiting to join us, a special panel of people whose lives intersect with crime and the criminal justice system. So let's start with a simple question about crime. Are you worse off today than you were a year ago? Most Americans will probably say yes. That from Gallup, which has been asking that same question since 1990. That top line on your screen, by the way, are people who think that crime is worse off today than it was a year ago. But that's the perception. The reality overall may be different. The rate of violent crime is actually near historic lows. This chart you're looking at right now going all the way back to the mid-1980s. Still, the homicide rate, the number of people being killed in this country, is starting to rise, and with it raising fears and ending too many lives in cities and towns nationwide. So who's to blame? Many of you will say it is the prosecutors, the people who let all of those violent criminals out of the prisons when the pandemic hit. Others will say it is the judges. Others still will say it is the police. First up tonight, our criminal justice correspondent, Jamal Andrews. Jamal?
Throughout 2020 and 2021, crime rose. The FBI estimates a 30% increase in homicides nationwide. But why? Some blame prisons and jails for releasing inmates early during the pandemic to alleviate crowding.
And this is all a result of naive and foolish policies that are letting prisoners out of jail early.
But several new studies that track the behavior and outcomes of those prisoners who were released suggest something different. Here are the facts. The CARES Act ultimately allowed for more than 11,000 federal prisoners to be released to home confinement. But those prisoners were screened. Of those who were released early, the Bureau of Prisons reported 17 people had reoffended within 2 years. That's 0.15%.
It's been an incredible success.
Kevin Ring is the executive director of FAM, a federal prisoner advocacy organization.
There's obviously lots of people in the federal prison system who don't need to be there. Doesn't mean they don't need to be punished. Doesn't mean they don't need to be held accountable. But it does mean they don't necessarily need to be, 300 miles from their family when they can be back in the community with an ankle monitor working, paying taxes, and raising their family.
On the state level, many prisons and jails initiated similar efforts.
Today, I am signing an executive order to help preserve this balance between health on the one hand and public health and public safety on the other.
With some states like New Jersey releasing more than 2,200 people at once, New Jersey cut its prison population by 40% in less than a year. And while crime in New Jersey jumped in 2021, it's not clear it's because of these releases. Just 9% of those released were reincarcerated within the year, according to The Gothamist. So if it's not early release, what is to blame for the spike in murders? There isn't broad agreement, but there is some consensus. Economic and social stress from COVID and the interruption of programs like after school. And still the possibility that strained relations in some communities between people and the police may be leading to officers pulling back and people not providing information on crimes. Jamal Andrus, Scripps News.
Jamal, thank you very much. You hear the sirens as they make their way down Pratt Street here in Baltimore. Let's go now to the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama. Stephen Reed is the Democratic mayor of that city. He took office back in November of 2019. He grew up in Montgomery, becoming the first African-American and youngest ever probate judge. Mr. Mayor, thanks for being with us. I want to begin with a basic question. Do you believe that most of your fellow mayors actually walk the streets that they govern? Do you believe that most of the governors, most of the presidents that we elect nowadays, most of all of the elected officials, do you believe that they actually interact with the people that they are talking tough about?
Thanks for having me, Dale. I really appreciate it. I certainly do. I work with the National League of Cities, the African American Mayors Association, and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. So I work with mayors of all parties, of all backgrounds, all across this country. And public safety is number one on all of our agendas. And what we hear and we continuously see is that we're all trying to figure out how to reduce crime, how to make our city safer for our residents and those that are working there. But also we're looking for common sense gun legislation. We're looking for, smart legislation, smart gun reform that will help us as well. So when we are out on the streets, you hear different things as to why people are carrying more guns. Right here in Alabama, a permitless carry law was passed last year against the wishes of law enforcement leaders, our Sheriff's Association, as well as our Police Chiefs Association. And yet we continue to wonder why we're having more shootings. Well, it doesn't help when access to automatic rifles is easier in some cases than other things that people would need to do on a common everyday basis. So we've got to really look at all the issues that impact the community.
Yeah, let me ask, let's start with that, what you just brought up, common sense gun legislation. If it's common sense gun legislation, why is it so hard to get passed? And I know the Democrats tonight are going to blame the Republicans and the Republicans are going to blame the Democrats. But why is it so tough to get something done when 70% of the American public all agree they want assault weapons off of the street? They want background checks, universal background checks. They want people to basically be educated on the guns that they have, not necessarily take them away, but be more responsible with them. Why is that so tough?
Listen, I'm in Alabama, so I've got guns at home, okay? So, this isn't about taking guns away from people. I think we have to explain that in a better way to the general public. And I think our lawmakers have to show some political courage and not just issue empty statements of thoughts and prayers when things bad happen in our cities and our communities. Now, at the end of the day, it does come down to the individual as well. And so we try to make sure that we're getting out in front of that here in Montgomery by being proactive, by trying to reach those who may be on the margins and talking to them not only about gun safety, but also about conflict resolution, how to walk away, how to deal with issues without feeling like they have to resort to something that is a final decision, likely for one, if not more than one party in that situation. And I think for a lot of leaders across political ideology, there is a understanding that there's a need for us to be smart about this at this time. The United States is far and above the outlier when it comes to mass shootings. We have to do better, not only to protect our communities, but to protect our men and women in blue.
So I want to read something that the Montgomery Advisor, your newspaper, said. They published it in March. They said the issue was gang violence. It says in part, this sort of gang violence and lawlessness, wanton, senseless, sadistic, arrogant, is quickly becoming more normal than abnormal in some of Alabama's major cities. In December alone, Montgomery witnessed gang-related shootings everywhere, from the campuses of high schools to the front doorstep of the mayor's office. What do you say about an article that says that nothing's being done, that not enough is being done?
Well, I'm not aware of a gang shooting happening at the front door of the mayor's office, so that may be a little bit of hyperbole. But what I will say is that we know that gangs certainly are an issue, but quite often what we see here in Montgomery these are shootings that are happening between people who know one another or who are involved in another illicit activity. It may be drugs, it may be prostitution, it may be sometimes even a domestic incident. But for us in our city, we saw crime drop last year. We saw our efforts around 21st century policing work. We saw our outreach work. We saw our investment in community centers and wraparound services assist us, along with the creation of an Office of Violence Prevention. So when we look at these things, we know there's no one silver bullet to address this. It has to be a coalition. It has to be a broad-based, well-rounded, holistic approach to pushing back on gun violence and making sure that those that are in our cities, regardless of where they may be, understand that there is another way to deal with conflict and to deal with disagreements.
I want to get your take on this. One of the pushes has been to make a mandatory minimum 10-year sentence for anyone who has a gun while committing a crime, 20 years if they fire that crime. Are you for that?
No, I'm not for mandatory minimums. I think we've seen those approaches to criminal justice, and unfortunately, they tend to target black and brown men more so than any other group. And so I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer, again, is a multi-pronged approach to addressing violence in our cities. Also understanding the role that social media now plays in the proliferation of guns and assault rifles and what that really means. And so I don't think mandatory sentences is the answer either. I think we have to look at this from the perspective of how do we each address in our local communities these issues to better impact the outcomes that we want. And that's through education. That's certainly through opportunities for jobs. And that's also through making sure that adults can feel like they're getting reskilled and they aren't being penalized if they have made a mistake, so that we don't see that recidivism rate, continue to increase of those that have been in the penal system and come out and just can't figure out how to get back into the workforce. So there are a number of things that we can do locally to address this. But again, I go back to the United States in particular has an abundance of assault rifles. And I think that under the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that certainly President Biden pushed for, there are things within that we can all see as potential options for us to make a dent, to reduce what the violence that we're seeing in our
right.
cities.
There are 389 million firearms in circulation in this country. 100 million of those firearms are assault weapons. Mr. Mayor, please stand by for us, because when we come back, we're going to talk about the issue of shoplifting. Big stores like Walmart are actually closing their doors. Others are locking up just about everything these days, including socks. How did it get like that? And how are we going to stop it? You're watching a Scripps News special report, The Truth About Crime. Welcome back. I'm Del Walters, live in Baltimore. It used to be when you went shopping, only the expensive stuff was locked up, the jewelry, the electronics, the razors. But nowadays, you might find that even your socks are under lock and key, and that is if you can find them at all. Just one reality these days is shoplifting across this country soars. Maritza Giorgio has more.
As Portland wakes up, downtown store owners like Stephen Lynn prepare to welcome shoppers. But opening the store looks a lot different than it did a few years ago.
We didn't have gates on the entryway. We weren't worried about our windows being broken, and shoplifting was something that almost never happened.
And now?
We've gone through a lot. I actually put my hand in my pocket, make sure my mace is available. I go to steel gates, and I have to open them with a key.
Lynn's business is one of more than 50% of small businesses across the country that report an increase in shoplifting.
We've gone up 800%. So the changes are stark, and there are things that I didn't expect when I opened a small business so many years ago.
It's not just Portland and not just small businesses.
Organized retail crime is happening everywhere. Large national retailers, small businesses.
The National Retail Federation estimates stolen goods cost retailers $94 billion in 2021. It says the bigger problem isn't about individual shoplifters as much as it is organized retail crime.
These are criminal enterprises that organize, plan, and orchestrate groups of shoplifters who go in and steal often and large quantities of theft.
You've likely seen the videos of brazen thefts at high-end retailers, so-called smash and grabs. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce sent this letter to members of Congress urging them to pass legislation to stop the sale of stolen items online. The letter says 25% of small businesses report raising prices because of shoplifting. And it's not just the sting of retail losses businesses feel.
We've had 3 major windows broken out with rocks, with grabbing product out through the windows. Each of my windows is a little over $4,500 to replace.
There's also the cost of extra security measures in the form of gates, staff, cameras. Some larger retailers are locking up everyday items like coffee, deodorant, even socks.
What's going to happen is that we're going to end up having more barriers to make shopping entertaining. And when you put barriers in place, that's going to hurt the businesses even more.
This impacts the consumer as much as it impacts the retailer.
Shuttered storefronts across the U.S. In San Francisco, Walgreens says it closed multiple stores in 2021 because of organized retail crime. Oregon lawmakers are now considering a pair of bills to combat the problem, one that would set aside $5 million to help pay for more law enforcement. The other would up the penalties for anyone convicted of organized retail theft. If passed, the state would join a handful of others that stiffened the punishment for stealing last year.
But guess what? We're fed up. We are fed up.
That store owner you just met tells us he has hope, not only because of new measures being passed in certain states, but also because of his collaboration with other small business owners to work on solutions. Listen, this is personal to him. His inventory is his retirement, like so many other small business owners. Maritza Giorgio, Scripps News.
Maritza, thank you very much. And by the way, Maritza, just to put a pin on what you said, just last week, Target said that it lost $1 billion in inventory because of people shoplifting, one of the major problems facing our country. I want to bring in a special panel right now. Julia Janae is a Court TV correspondent, our sister network, Court TV, by the way. Dave Ehrenberg is the state's attorney for Palm Beach County, Florida. And also we're joined by Bill Haskins, a former NYPD police officer, a former cop who now works in private security. So, Mr. Haskins, I'll begin with you. Who is to blame?
We are to blame as a
Julia,
culture.
I can't hear Bill.
Okay,
go ahead. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay, when you see prosecutors saying in press conferences that they're not going to prosecute, larceny crimes up to $1,000, well, guess what? The bad guy feels, well, I'm going to go shopping up until $1,000. And we've seen videos across the country of people walking in mass, multiple people, whether it's supermarkets, whether it's drugstores, whether it's shopping, and it's like open season. And when that happens, it becomes systemic, and then it just goes downhill from there, a la the broken windows theory.
So, Dave, I want to go with you since he basically blamed the prosecutors. You told us that you're proud of the fact that you have no organized theft rings in Palm Beach, Florida. I want you to listen to why you think that is.
What I think is being done in some other areas of the country, I think is a step too far. There are those who support some of these reforms saying, hey, the number of violent crimes have not appreciably gone up because of this, but if people feel unsafe, then that's a problem. Because perception is reality. You have to find the right balance, and I think it is wrong-headed to ignore shoplifting because then it just encourages shoplifting rings. We don't have shoplifting rings here in Palm Beach County. And I think one reason is that we prosecute those cases. We don't turn a blind eye to shoplifting up to $950 or whatever the amount is.
So Dave, do you prosecute every criminal case in Palm Beach County, Florida?
Well, it's good to be with you. We make a decision based on the unique facts of every case, and we take shoplifting seriously. Now, look, there are diversion programs for first-time offenders, but we are tough on shoplifting rings. And if someone has a rap sheet, we hold them accountable. And we are not going to turn a blind eye to people who shoplift up to $950. We take it all seriously. And Bill's right. If you have a prosecutor who says, we're not going to prosecute these cases up to a certain amount, that sends a message to the criminals that it's fair game, it's open season, and that's what creates, I think, this problem that you have, where you have these organized gangs coming in and stealing because they know there are no consequences, and it's dangerous because you have shoppers there in between, and you have a demoralization of the public when they see all their goods locked up behind a case. So that's why it's important that prosecutors and law enforcement take these crimes seriously.
So Deanna Hoskins is with us as well. Deanna, you have experience in the criminal justice system from the other side of the bars. Your thoughts on two people we've heard from so far tonight who say, lock them up.
Thank you, Dale. Yeah, it was kind of disturbing to hear it from a prosecutor and a police officer's perspective. Being a person who actually was convicted of a theft charge, I think we have to pay attention to socioeconomic status, the increase in substance abuse. My theft was a direct result of my substance abuse issue. With the lack of resources and social safety nets in our community, the lack of programming, it's almost as if you have to be arrested to even get access to any type of treatment. We haven't paid attention to the pandemic, the inflation that is going on, where prices are going up, but people's ability to get paid or obtain jobs have actually decreased. And another thing that when we look at situations of a person and then locking them up in jail, my question is always, if I was stealing to eat, if I was stealing to feed a drug addiction, what is sitting in jail going to do for me to actually be a cost barrier to the taxpayers versus possibly having diversion programs or some interaction that doesn't have to be punitive that results in that felony conviction or that criminal charge, which is going to exacerbate my ability to even get employment or housing moving out of that. So there are factors we have to look into this that within the court system, from a prosecutor and the police officers, I understand doing their job. And I'm not saying people shouldn't be held accountable, but it doesn't have to be a punitive measure that actually becomes a life sentence for that individual. Sometimes putting the resources into the community to ensure people have access to basic safety nets. And there was I believe it was the prosecutor, I'm sorry, I'm not recalling your name, but you said something very important when you said the community has the right to feel safe. I challenge you to say, do the individuals you're prosecuting not have a right to feel safe and whole as well, that some of those criminal activities is a result of that lack of security and safety within the community they reside.
Deanna, hold that thought. I want to go to Julia for a second. And Julia, one of the deals with crime is that everybody wants to solve the criminal justice system problem. Everybody says they want to get tough on crime. They want to lock up the bad guys. But the truth of the matter is you're out there and you're in the courts all the time. Do poor people have those high-powered lawyers that we see on Law and Order where all of a sudden in an hour we find out if they are truly guilty or innocent, or is the system overwhelmed prosecutors who have too many cases to really represent their clients well?
They do have the benefit that they are afforded under the law, where they are given an attorney if they aren't able to afford a high-powered attorney. They may even have an appointed lawyer who may, in some situations, be handling the high-profile ones, but in a situation of someone who's indigent, they would get an attorney. So you don't necessarily see it. I see great public defenders every day fighting very hard for their clients, but I think the criminal justice system is dealing with a lot of criticism right now, and it's only heightened since 2020, where there's a question of, are we prosecuting too much? Are we prosecuting for the wrong things? The murder of George Floyd was prompted by a claim of a counterfeit $20 bill. And you even see most recently this reaction to the killing of Banco Brown in San Francisco, who was someone who was shoplifting an alleged amount of $14 and was shot by a security guard, and prosecutors declined to actually go after that security officer, saying that he was in fear of his life and it was self-defense. So there is a lot of criticism, but I think what I expect to see is a transformation of how courts handle specifically shoplifting.
I want our panel to stand by because you know the old song on Beretta, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. But what happens after you do the time? What happens when you're branded with that capital C, that scarlet letter that stops you from being able to get a job, sometimes branding people for life? Later, how anger and fear over crime is fueling our politics nationwide. You'll hear why former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is pushing her party, says it pushed her party out of power. This is The Truth About Crime. You're watching Scripps News.
I was actually laying in my bed one day in 2015, and President Obama came on the television. And he said that the federal government was moving to a fair hiring policy. They were banning the box on the federal applications, and that people who had been convicted of a crime had the opportunity to apply for federal employment. I don't know if it was coincidence, but 2 days later, I got a call to do an interview.
You're watching a Scripps News special, The Truth About Crime. Here again from Baltimore, Del Walters.
That's Deanna Hoskins describing her own experience of trying to land a job with a criminal record. That is the central question of our criminal justice system. What is fair and what is not, and what happens to those people who do get caught up in the system, as it is called? The panel's back. Court TV's Julia Janae is with us. Dave Ehrenberg, of course, the state attorney down in Palm Beach County, Florida. Deanna Hoskins, you just heard from her. And Bill Stanton. By the way, Bill, apologies for getting your name wrong in the beginning. The sirens were going by and I could barely hear myself talk. But Deanna, I'll begin with you and that question of what is it like when you're having that conversation with your friends and everything is going fine, and then they say, well, there's that gap in your resume. And you say, well, that's because I spent time behind bars. What happens then? Do you get the job?
Well, actually, you know, that there's one of the myths of how I even got into the work was realizing that the criminal background, the time spent incarcerated, truly was not a gap in my resume, that a resume is a list of experiences. And for somewhere around in the world, we have told people it's paid experience. Prisons and jails are ran by the people who are incarcerated. So whether you worked in the kitchen, whether you worked in the maintenance department, there are actually skills to put on your resume, but it still doesn't stop the fact of the background check. So that question does come up. And a lot of times I had to explain the question as, you know, there was a time of incarceration, which was a direct result of a substance abuse issue that I had, where I was held accountable for a theft charge that I committed. How I got into this work is because I was offered jobs contingent on that background check. And once that background check came back, the job offer was revoked. And I started asking people for the policy, only to find out employers didn't have written policy. It had just become a practice across this country that we're not going to hire people with criminal backgrounds within our industry in the system, which is thus how I got thrown into the policy arena to fight for those policies around employment.
So Dave Ehrenberg, when does the sentence end? You say that you're for putting people away so that people can feel safe in their homes. But as far as the people who have done the time, when does their sentence actually end, in your opinion, if they are released back into society in Palm Beach and they're sitting next to you in the restaurant?
Well, in my view, once someone has paid their debt to society, served their time, paid off any restitution, and finished their probation, they should be allowed to re-enter society. They should be allowed to get their civil rights back, including their voting rights back in nearly all cases. Florida makes it really difficult. And that's something I've been a big opponent of, because I think that it makes us less safe when you create a permanent subclass of the population who's not allowed to have civil rights, not allowed to find jobs, as Deanna said, because of the boxes that keep you from getting employment. What do you expect those people to do once they're a returning citizen? If they're not going to be allowed to be part of society and get a job and be a productive tax-paying citizen, they're going to be antagonistic to society. They're going to work against society, and they're going to commit more crimes. So it makes us less safe if we don't have a procedure where they can re-enter society. So I'm a big believer in doing that.
So, Julia, what are you seeing across the country when you travel and you go to so many trials and you see these defendants on trial? Are formerly incarcerated people getting a fair shake, or does the system treat them like they are less than once they get out of jail or prison?
They're certainly discriminated against. There's no doubt about that. When I see the different defendants who are either sitting in trials and they're being represented, the fact that they have something in their past, people want to take that and say that that points to why they are there because of that history. But I do think that there are nonprofits and groups that are so dedicated to making sure people think beyond that. The Ban the Box movement of saying that it shouldn't be on the application, but if you need to talk about it once you get into the interview, dig deeper. Ask that person more about why it happened and what they've learned since then to really understand more. But I think there is a shift that could happen, that could be better in terms of how people treat those who do have that and pay their debt to society, as we call it.
So, Bill, what about you? When does the time served end, and how concerned are you as somebody who actually puts the handcuffs on the people who wind up being locked up, that the system is getting it wrong so many times? I have talked to so many prosecutors across this country who say that they're worried that the percentage of people behind bars who are innocent is higher than most people think. What are your thoughts?
Well, this is a far larger question. It's a code everybody's trying to crack. I will tell you, I love Palm Beach County. I do feel safe when I go there. I'll be there next week. So the counselor is doing something, the prosecutor is doing something definitely right over there. But to answer your question, we also have to look at the victim. We're looking at best case scenarios where the bad guy, if you will, commits a crime and they truly want to be rehabilitated. They'll go to school in prison, they'll get a degree, and they'll work hard at that rehabilitation. But let's look at the darker side of this. What about the recidivism? The crime, the people that keep making the same crime over and over again, where we're reading in the paper across the country, an individual was arrested 20, 30 times, and then they committed the ultimate act and they murdered someone. Who's protecting the victims? We're hearing a lot about the perpetrator and their rights, but I'm not hearing anything about the victims, and we need to protect the law-abiding citizens first and foremost. And then additionally, look to rehabilitate, and I think you do that with education, starting with our youth. Starting with the youth, educate them about crime, about walking, learning, work, responsibility, self-reliance.
Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I want to try and get in as many questions and answers as we can. So, Deanna, what do you think about that? Do we spend too much time talking about the people who are behind bars and not enough time talking about the people who are the victims?
I'm glad Bill brought that up to say we're talking about the victim, talking more about perpetrators than the victims. And traditionally, we know through research, hurt people. Traditionally, the individuals who end up becoming a perpetrator were victims at one time that was never paid attention to. So we have to look at a Jordan Neely, right? Jordan was actually choked to death on a subway, dealt with mental illness, being hungry, asking for food, different things of that nature. But when they went back in his history, there was a time where a death of a parent, right, being in a foster care system, he was a victim that the system failed, that ultimately resulted in his death. But when we look at that situation, we only want to look at the other side of it, at the ultimate crime, when we had times within the system to address the individual who ultimately becomes a perpetrator. But I also want to address the fact of, again, I think he's made a comment around the recidivism rate. Having been a person who's been successful in reentry, who worked in the Department of Justice, who managed all of the federal government's investment in corrections and reentry, the definition of recidivism is only to make the system looks good. Because a person could be homeless and not go back to prison. A person could be out using substance abuse and not go back to prison. So truly are we ensuring that people are successful and not using recidivism to determine if the system is successful.
So Dave, I want to give you the last word on this. You've been a prosecutor now for 10 years. Have you changed your mind about anything that you see in the criminal justice system?
It's been 11 years now, Del, and my experience has taught me that there is a place for criminal justice reform. We've enacted some diversion programs that didn't exist before. We've tried to treat juveniles properly. I think when it comes to juveniles, we sometimes get stupid on crime by charging them as adults when they can be rehabilitated. Now, if a 17-year-old who carjacks you with a gun, we're going to send him to adult prison, an adult court. But if it's a 16-year-old selling marijuana, that's a different situation, and you have to be able to judge everything on its own merits. But overall, you have to pay attention to the way people feel. I realize that crime rates statistically may not be going up, but people feel unsafe. And if people feel unsafe in the community, then you're not doing your job right, because perception is reality. And I appreciate the comments of Bill coming down to Palm Beach County because he feels safe. That's what we want. We want people to come here because they feel safe, not being scared to go to the local drugstore to buy some goods.
I want to thank all of you for being so candid in your answers. When we come back, it is the issue that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says costs the Democrats their majority in Congress. So what happens next in our fight against crime? Stay with us.
I will not seek re-election to Democratic leadership in the next Congress.
That's former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi handing over the reins of power to a new minority being the key word there, because they lost the majority. She blames Democrats in New York and the issue of crime for Democrats losing the overall majority in House. The panel is back right now. This time, though, we're joined by our Scripps News National Political Director, Andrew Rafferty. Andrew, set the stage. How is crime affecting politics nationwide?
Good evening, Del, and anyone who's watching this from a state that had a high-profile Senate race or a close House race in their district knows that crime was one of the top topics in terms of advertising and messaging from especially Republican candidates heading into last year's midterms. But look at this. It actually ended up being a distant third in terms of importance in those midterms last year. You could see it was inflation and abortion were the top two. Just about 1 in 10 cared about crime. And so that is why perhaps, I know Nancy Pelosi saying that this was a big issue that cost Democrats the House, but it also was not sort of red wave that we were expecting given the political climate. And here's one of the reasons why crime, I think, didn't penetrate the way that a lot of people or Republicans were hoping it was going to. And you can see there, 81% of voters who say crime is very important in their vote were black voters. And so when we think about the issue of crime, especially when it comes to politics, the thinking is Republicans specifically are trying to reach those suburban voters, those moderate voters. They're trying to scare them essentially. But there's a whole sector of the population, people who are living in inner cities, people who are have very different personal experiences with crime, who are coming at this with a much different perspective, a perspective that Republican kind of messaging on the issue hasn't resonated with. And I think that gets to the complexities that don't always get talked about when we're talking about how voters are reacting to the issue of crime, because crime is very different depending on who you are and where you're being impacted by it, Del.
Dave, a very tough question for you. You're an elected official down in Palm Beach County, and money is the lifeblood of politics. One of the criticisms of the political system is that rich people get their wishes known and poor people don't. Do you make decisions based on the will of the voters or on the will of the donors?
Oh, my goodness. Del, you have to make decisions based on only the evidence and the law. You never make decisions based on someone's wealth. You don't make decisions based on the political whims either. And that, if that means you don't get reelected, so be it. It's not a job for someone who wants to follow the polls. Sometimes you have to take positions that your voters may not like because you just follow the evidence and the law, no matter how unpopular the decision may be.
So Bill and Deanna, I want to give each of you 30 seconds because we're running tight on time. Bill, I'll start with you. What would you like politicians to do differently?
I would like politicians to be honest. I would like politicians to serve no more than 2 to 3 terms and get out. Because the longer they stay, the more they become corrupt, my opinion.
Deanna, same question to you. What would you like to see politicians do differently?
I definitely would like to see politicians undo some of the harms of the 94 crime bill, overturning mandatory minimums, but also investing in communities. When we talked about the defunding the police, it was not defunding to decrease police. It was shifting the over amount of financial incentives into the law enforcement and putting those back into the community so that we have community safety nets around prevention programs so we don't have to have conversations about reentry. We're really talking about no entry.
I want to thank you for being with us this evening. Our goal here at Scripps News is to listen to you, not to talk at you, and to hear what it is that you had to say, and I think our viewers were well saved. When we come back, a personal thought about why this moment in time is so important. Stay with us. Back now in our closing moments with a personal reflection. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to what is going on around us. And I know because I speak from personal experience. In 2010, I was an adjunct professor at Bowie State University, just outside of Washington, D.C. Many of my students were caught in the crossfire then of the war on drugs. And I remember one day asking them, how many of you knew somebody who was shot or incarcerated? They all raised their hands. One day, one of my students became agitated, and I asked him what was wrong. And he opened up his jacket, and he brandished a gun, a 9mm that was popular at that time. And I said, is that a gun? And he looked at me and he said, what do you think it is? At that point in time, I asked all of my students to please calmly leave. And the student then left the classroom. Another student actually followed and tried to stop him. And I said, no, that's not how this story is going to end. On my way home that day, my wife asked me, anything happened in school today? And I said, yeah, one of my students pulled a gun. And she said, did you report it? And I said, no. And she said, go back, report it. I had become numb to all of the killings that were happening in the 80s and 90s in this country. So the school also seemed to acquiesce that, okay, something happened, but it wasn't that big a deal. That afternoon, he pistol whipped a bus driver. And then that weekend, he went to a shopping mall. And at that shopping mall, he was confronted by a local police officer, and that student was shot and killed. As we say goodbye, think about this number. That was 2010. Since then, 542,000 people have died. My question as we say goodnight, if we do nothing 10 years from now, what will that number be? We cannot afford to be silent. They cannot afford for us to do so as well. Thanks for watching. Good night.